everybody. So good to see you here. I'm Gabi Weinberg, Senior Director of the Joshua Project, and we're waiting for a few of our friends to get settled. So wherever you may be, at home, at work, on the road, tuning in for our first installment of Compelling Conversations. If you're comfortable, it would be awesome if you just make your name your real name. So in the event that we get to call on you or get to see you, we get to know who you are, and you're not mysterious first initial, last initial, or somebody before was princess, which could be a first name obviously, but maybe their last name would come with it, unless it's like Prince. I guess Prince, it was a singular name, so maybe it's the same idea. It's good to see you here. Welcome. Stephen, it's good to see you, and Rosalind and Lashana, thank you for being here. Bob, I love the background. Good to see Shalom Lamb here. Good to see Deborah, Omar, Lauren. Welcome everybody. We're super excited to see you. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. As people sometimes are to be, right on time or just a minute or two late, we want to give them the courtesy of getting to hear the full conversation. Like I said, I know we're in many time zones here today, earlier with the team as we were checking in, so I'm grateful for everyone coming. And, I think we'll get started in just another minute. Like I said, we're just waiting for a couple more people to join in. Obviously, I want to give a big shout out to the FCBC Family of Champions team with Derek and Pete, who have been helping us on the tech here this evening. So thank you for that. You won't get to hear them, but they're awesome people who've been really taking care of us this moment. Okay, we have one more minute and then we'll get started. We're so grateful to have such a nice crowd this evening at the first session of Compelling Conversations. And as you may already know, some of you have gotten an email from me. I'm Gabi Weinberg, and I'm proud to be the Senior Director of the Joshua Project, which is a part of the B'nai Zion family of programs and projects that we work on. And this is a big night for us. It's our first installment of Compelling Conversations. And just the 5-second history of the Compelling Conversations model is I was in conversation with the CEO of B'nai Zion. You'll hear him tonight, Ari Lamm. We were kind of thinking about what are ways to engage the community on the questions that we care about. We care about the Hebrew Bible and the different relationships that Americans have with it. And it's a truly unique resource in understanding and exploring what it means to be American. We're hoping in the longer term to deliver inspiring and relevant educational content through our web platform. But when we were looking at just the state of affairs around us in the news, we said, we can't wait. Let's just get this rolling. And many of you already know Bishop Ulmer, and I'll introduce him in just a second. But Bishop Ulmer was a willing interlocutor for Ari, and Maayan quickly joined on. You'll hear about them in just a second. But this community and this cause of studying the Hebrew Bible, studying the important questions of faith in this particular moment, which sometimes might be more difficult, sometimes might be more obvious, is just a necessity. And we figured, at least to start, we know that there is a different show on tonight that some of you may or may not be tuning into in the presidential debates. But as we say, that when it comes to this question of faith and our values and figuring out how to bring them into the world, there's no debate. We must we must think about these questions. We must engage and discuss them. So thank you all for being here. And as I said, I'm Gabi Weinberg, and I'm going to turn it over to our main event just after I do some introductions. So first, hailing from the holy city of Jerusalem is Maayan Jaffe-Hoffman, who is our moderator this evening. If you're keeping track at home, it's almost 3 a.m. in Jerusalem. I'm sure some of you have the Jerusalem clock on your computers to have it easily accessible. She's during the day and night, when she's not moderating these conversations, she's the news editor and the head of online content and strategy for the Jerusalem Post, who are kindly sharing this program tonight as well on their Facebook page, and we thank them for that partnership. She's the former vice president of marketing and brand strategy for Israel 365 and the editorial director for Breaking Israel News and the former director of international communications for the Israel Democracy Institute. And we're so thrilled to have Maayan with us, and she's an essential worker in Israel right now, and they're in the middle of a lockdown, so she's out. It's still able to be in her office, but her at home she has her family of 5 children and 2 stepchildren, as well as her husband Gil Hoffman, who is the chief political correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. And so thank you, Maayan, for being here, hailing in from the holy city of Jerusalem. We're so excited to get this rolling with you tonight. Second up, we have my colleague and my friend, Ari Lamm. He's the scion of one of America's leading rabbinic families, and he is the visionary behind the Joshua Project. Rabbi Lamm received his ordination from the historic Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary and his doctorate in the history of Judaism and Christianity from Princeton University. He previously served as the special advisor to the president at Yeshiva University, helping lead the country's largest Jewish institution for higher education. He has spoken across the country and the globe on the importance of faith in the public square, and he and his wife Shlomit have 3 and almost 4, with God's help, amazing children. And we're so glad Ari is able to tune in with us tonight from Teaneck, Rabbi Lamm. It's always good to see you when you're in your studio at home. And finally, the man whose energy and encouragement has brought us this moment, Bishop Ulmer, needs no introduction, but it's just the honor, importance of opening. In the Talmud, we say "bichvod achsanya," with the deference to the host, and you and your family at FCBC, the Family of Champions, have been, just like their names, champions, and we really appreciate that partnership. And he's the senior pastor of Faithful Central Bible Church in Los Angeles since 1982, and in 2000 they purchased the Great Western Forum. For those following along at home, the home of the LA Lakers, and then they operated both as a church and as a location for entertainment venues at the same time. And Dr. Ulmer, not short of accolades, but he's the founding board member of and former president of the King's University in Los Angeles, and the adjunct professor and director of the King's at Oxford, an annual summer session held at Oxford University. After accepting his call to the ministry, Dr. Ulmer founded Macedonia Bible Church in San Pedro, California. Dr. Ulmer is currently the presiding bishop over Macedonia International Bible Fellowship, an association of pastors representing ministries in Africa and the United States, and based in Johannesburg, South Africa. In addition, Dr. Ulmer is the founder and CEO of the Ulmer Institute, a nonprofit organization focused on the research, training, and treatment of psychological trauma in urban communities. Dr. Ulmer has written several books, including Passion, God, Training to Win, A Spiritual Guide to Victorious Living, Passing the Generation, Blessing, and his latest book, Walls Can Fall, Race, Reconciliation, and Righteousness in a Divided World. Dr. Ulmer and his wife have been married for over 40 years. God bless, that's beautiful, and have 2 daughters, 1 son, and 5 grandchildren. I will now cede the floor to Maayan to oversee this wonderful conversation. Thank you all for being here, and we're so glad to have a compelling conversation with you tonight.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Gabi. It's really exciting to be able to be here and to be able to host this. And I wanted to just kick us off actually by setting the playing field a little bit and getting an understanding of what we're even doing here. So, Rabbi Lamm, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what the Bible says about politics. Why are we holding this conversation tonight from your perspective?
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you, Maayan, for being with us. It's 2 a.m. in Israel. I can't believe that you're here. It's amazing. And Bishop Ulmer, my new friend, and I can already tell my longtime friend, thank you so much for hosting me, you and your family, the family of champions. I'm so, the Yiddish expression is verklempt. I'm verklempt to be here, which means I can't, I'm pinching myself for being here. This is really wonderful. Anyone who's watched Veep, House of Cards, Parks and Recreation, so when you think about politics, you think dirty, villainous, or maybe just a bunch of idiots running around. And I think that's sort of, at this moment in American history, how we've come to this is what we've come to expect from politicians. Like, that's the most we'll ever get, just a bunch of, at best, bumbling idiots, at worst, corrupt villains. And I think we tend to think that that's sort of a morally appropriate way to think about politics. But in fact, the way that the Bible thinks about politics is actually radically different from that, right? So think about the very first politician we ever meet in the Bible, Joseph, Book of Genesis, right? So even if you're familiar with the Joseph story, great. Even if not, the quick rundown is, it's the Book of Genesis. His brothers sell him into slavery in Egypt. He eventually rises up to become sort of the prime minister of Egypt. And when Joseph, a saint, describes his view of politics, he uses two Hebrew words. And here it's really important to know a little bit of ancient Hebrew. The words that he uses to describe politics are chokhmah and binah. And those ancient Hebrew words mean wisdom and understanding. Now, that's important because, in fact, that is exactly how the Bible describes itself. So when Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, and this is why knowing a little Hebrew is important, when Moses describes what the Bible itself is, he says to the Israelites gathered around him, the great prophet and lawgiver and liberator Moses, he says that the Bible is your chokhmah and binah, your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations. So in other words, what Moses is saying is that, rightly understood, the Bible itself is the greatest political document ever constructed. And so if we want to think about how is politics worth engaging? Is it dirty? Is it fundamentally filthy, something we should stay away from? On the contrary, the Bible tells us that politics is actually so holy and sacred that it's like the Bible itself. Now, how do you get a politics that is actually holy as opposed to the nonsense that we see in the news every day? How do you actually get a politics that is chokhmah and binah, that's wisdom and understanding? And the answer is, you need to understand how the Bible's understanding of society was totally different than any other society that had come before, from the Greeks to the Romans to the Egyptians, you name it. Was every other society thought that the best way to run a country or the best way to conduct politics was to conquer, was to dominate, was to force everybody else to do what you want to do. That's why every great nation that ever lived, what was the thing that they tried to do? What was the thing that they spent all their time thinking about how to do? To conquer more territory, to get more people, to get more subjects, and to get more people who would listen to whatever you wanted to say. The Bible was the first tradition of wisdom in the entire world. It was the first revelation in the entire world that actually said, no, first of all, you don't conquer. That's why the Israelites have a land, the land of Israel, and they're not allowed to conquer anything outside of that. You get one place. And in that place, in your land, you're supposed to build a model society that can be a beacon of light to everybody else. Because the best way to run politics is through wisdom and understanding, not through dominating others, but through influencing others, through showing other people the way, not through punishing others, not through forcing others to do what you want, but actually living right so others can do right. That's the way that we do politics in the Bible.
So it's interesting how you describe that, Rabbi Lamm. And I want to move over for a minute to Bishop Ulmer, because he and I were speaking a little bit before, and he mentioned that there are several passages within the Bible that are actually quite revolutionary, that help us to better understand what you're trying to describe in terms of politics inside or inherent in the Bible. So Bishop Ulmer, could you tackle that? What is the most revolutionary teaching about politics in the Bible?
On what Ari has said, this idea of hukmah and of binah is that we receive that from God, and yet we are to flesh that out and live that. We're to live it out in a culture and in a world that didn't get it from God. And so the idea of conquering has to do with taking biblical divine revelations, taking the hukmah of God and the binah of God into cultures, into lands, into territories, if you will, who didn't hear that. And so in a sense, we're going into cultures that are, they are counter, they're antithetical to much of what we've received, if not all, what we've received from God. I think from my perspective, the most revolutionary and challenging, Maayan, revelation of scripture is to recognize that God says something about government, about politics in the Christian Bible, in all 66 books in the Christian Bible. Every book, both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, every book says something about the idea of politics or the idea of government. And what's most revolutionary for me, and I struggle with it, clearly establishes that it is God who set up, who created government. I mean, in the Christian Bible, we believe that God set up three institutions: the family, government, and the church, or the people of God. And so my struggle is that God says, I am God, and beside me there is no other. And the Christian Bible teaches us that it is God who sets up governments. And then because God is the source, if you will, of governments, that we are to pray for them. Now that's my problem, because I've seen a bunch of these guys in that big house, White House, that I'm struggling with praying for. And yet God says, I put them there and you are to pray for them. And so my prayer life struggles at election time. My prayer life struggles, after the elections, and I see who's sitting in that big house up there. And so for me, that is revolutionary. God says, I'm behind all this. And of course, when we go back to the biblical record, Ari, and we see the prophets speaking against and challenging kings and rulers, and we see the resistance to this God mindset, if you will. Therein lies my problem, because over and over, God is telling them, pray for your enemies and the strangers that come and all that, and that's revolutionary to me. That strains me, even in this time now of what, 30 some days before we're going to change political party, well, some's going to change, and so God says to me, I am to pray for who, in my side of town, we say, whosoever he puts in, whoever God puts in, I am to submit, I am to pray for them, I am to lift them up to God, and whether I vote for them or not. And quite honestly, I'm still praying about whom I vote, because I'm still dealing with others. Well, that's another conversation. But anyway, Maayan, you get my point.
Yeah, I definitely think that I do. And, in another hour, I guess we're going to have a debate between the two candidates to start to get a little bit more in touch with who we might choose to vote for in the United States. But it's interesting thinking about the United States for a minute. So as you and Rabbi Lamm have touched on, the Bible and politics have been inherently intertwined from time immemorial until the founding of the United States. Because in the United States, when the Constitution was signed, there was a separation of religion and state, and they were no longer intertwined. So explain to me how in America you make this connection. How do you pull it back together as a citizen of America, and also a rabbi? Rabbi Lamm, if you can take that question, and also you, Bishop, if you could take that question next.
Yeah, and I love, first of all, it's a great question, and it really just gets to the heart of what the bishop is talking about, which is there is clearly a divine, sort of a place in the divine economy for politics, and we have to figure out what it is. And, that really gets at, what I like to call sort of America's two founding documents. America really has two founding documents. It has a legal founding document, which is the Constitution, but it also has a moral founding document. And that moral founding document was always the Hebrew Bible. I'll just give you an example of how and by the way, I should mention that the two groups in American history that were most ferocious in keeping that tradition, that sort of civic political tradition alive of the Hebrew Bible as the moral foundation of this country, were the Jewish community and the African American community. That's the role that we've always played together, and that's critically important. And I'll give you an example of how this plays out. So for example, the great idea that animates the American experiment is the idea that democracy is not only a legitimate form of government, it's the only legitimate form of government, and that having a king is not only inefficient, it's actually wrong. It's wrong to have a king that rules over everybody else. Now, that idea that having a republic or a democracy is the only way to do things, you don't find that in the Greek tradition, you don't find that in the Roman tradition, you don't find that anywhere else. And in fact, the founding fathers knew this. They knew you couldn't find it anywhere else. Where does that idea come from? The answer is, it comes from perhaps the greatest collaboration between Jews and Christians across the ages, because 100 years, 200 years before America was founded, what Christians start to do is they actually start to translate great Hebrew texts. This was a movement, it was called actually Christian Hebraism. Great Christian thinkers start to translate Hebrew texts, not just the Bible, they start to translate the Talmud and the texts by ancient rabbis. And one of the things that they find in there, in an ancient writing by the rabbis, actually a commentary on the book of Deuteronomy, is that the rabbis say that having a king is not only a bad idea, it's actually idolatry. You're not allowed to have a king. And you start to see, I mean, it's really remarkable. Some of the great early thinkers about democracy start to quote rabbis, and they quote the Hebrew Bible, and they say, this is where we're getting our experiments from. So I think it would be a great mistake for us to think that what America does is sort of create a radical separation between faith and politics, or between sort of faith in the home and, you know, the public square, which has to be nothing. What America actually does is say, what we need to do is create a society where faith can flourish as much as possible, because faith is the great engine of goodness and virtue. And the way to do that is to create a society where we can tolerate each other and we can live with some sort of plural values, where we can say, listen, Judaism is good, we can have different forms of Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, you can have Islam, and all of these things can activate together. But fundamentally, this all needs to be undergirded by faith, because if you don't have, as the founders themselves knew, if you don't have faith, if you don't have a sense of moral grounding, this whole democracy experiment is a total disaster, and it descends into anarchy. And that's part of what we're seeing now. And Bishop, I'm curious what you think about that.
See, therein lies my challenge. Therein lies my challenge. And my challenge is that the idea of the country was founded on a biblical worldview and the principle of the Bible and faith. It seems to me that even in this grounding, this faith grounding, that grounding was selective. My struggle with that is that how can these guys lean so heavily on this book? How can these guys declare that we're founding this country on this book, and yet everybody in charge, this kills me, the whole culture believed, theoretically, that it was right to keep Black people in slavery? And I'm saying, which verse did you read, or which verse did you skip? Because I get it, one nation under God, but to say that we're founding it upon that, and then selectively say, but it's one nation under God, liberty and justice for all, except that group over there. Liberty and justice for all, liberty for all, but not liberty for that crowd. Therein lies my struggle. But it forces me then to look beyond the ones who created the document and look to the ones who created the world. In other words, I've got to look past them. If I get stuck with those guys, I'm in trouble, because I cannot reconcile their faith claim with their political action. They don't synthesize to me. And so I have to look beyond that, because it is amazing to me, the entire culture, for the most part, certainly the authorities said, It's okay to do that. It's okay to exclude them. It's okay to make them less than a man, less than that's okay. And it's okay because we're standing on this Bible. We're standing on this book. Therein lies my challenge, even until this, this very day, because I see this inconsistency, and the inconsistency is only resolved when I look past them and I look to the God that they say they were trusting and hear the word that they say they were following.
And by the way, I think that's critical, because here's where we need to I think we need another ancient Hebrew word here. The way that we talk about, the way that a lot of modern people talk about politics and the kind of political arrangement we have is they use the word contract. This is a social contract. And a contract is an agreement between you and me where I want something and you want something, and we compromise so that we can both maximally get what I want. Hebrew society has contracts, but it's fundamentally opposed to that. The ancient Hebrew word that describes society is actually berit. Berit means a covenant. A covenant is basically the opposite of a contract. A contract is about me pursuing my interests and you pursuing your interests, and we compromise so we get the worst of both worlds. A covenant is about us surrendering something of ourselves to each other so that we can actually come together and build a society together. Contracts are about convenience. Covenants are about identity. Who are we? What kind of home do we want to have together? Now, the biggest difference between a contract and a covenant is that a contract, you sign it once and it's done and it's binding forever. A covenant, because it's so much deeper than a contract and it's about who we are, it's about our identity, it's about the stories we tell ourselves, a covenant constantly needs to be renewed. And that is why, if you go through the Bible, if you go through the stories of the scriptures, you see that the Israelites, God commands the Israelites constantly to renew their covenant, to renew their brit. And this nation has constantly had to do that for the exact reason that you said, Bishop, which is that our initial covenant was woefully insufficient. In fact, it was sinful in many ways. We created a system where where some large number of our population, their divine image was not only not recognized, it was dismissed. I mean, it's grotesque, morally grotesque to do this. And so at every stage of our history, we've needed to refound the country, not because, it's not, you don't need one refounding and then you get it perfect. We need constant moments of refounding. So you could think of, the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, that's one founding. That's the first Thanksgiving. We recognize a higher power. We recognize God is above all of us. Then you have the literal American founding, 1776. The Declaration of Independence, in theory, everything should be great, but there is a great evil and injustice and sin and race idolatry that underlies all of it. Then you get to Frederick Douglass, you get to the Civil War, that's another refounding, and that gets us a little bit closer to where we need to go, but we're not there yet. Then you can move forward. There's the New Deal. There's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's an economic refounding. Then you get to Martin Luther King Jr., who's been to the mountaintop and he sees the promised land, but he's not there yet. And that's another refounding. Then you could think of Ronald Reagan, the importance of the individual and individual worth and winning the Cold War. It's another refounding. You think about President Obama and the idea of the Joshua generation, that we have more to go to get to the promised land. That's another refounding. We are clearly at a moment in American life and history and culture where we need a refounding. We need another refounding. And I think part of the challenge is when we think of America as a contract, just a way for each individual to get what he or she wants, that's when we lose our way. If we remember that we are a society, we are building an identity and a home together, and this is a covenant, this is a berit, that's when we understand that we need great refoundings. We need moments of great upheaval and great change. And if we don't have them, then we stagnate and we implode.
Well, here's my challenge to that. First of all, let's start with the covenant. The covenant concept includes or assumes an agreement, and I'll paraphrase, between two parties, between two legitimate parties. We weren't a party. We didn't qualify to enter into a contract. As a matter of fact, we weren't even allowed to read the contract. And so that's the first problem. The second thing is the idea of renewing the covenant, which I get. The challenge that we have today is that it seems as though generation after generation, those who were intentionally renewing that covenant and getting back to the grounding of what God has said became fewer and fewer. In other words, those who were doing that, so that the majority of the culture, the majority of society is paying two levels of attention to that covenant, little and none, because they're not renewing it. They see it of less and less value. And so I think the challenge now is how do we swing this pendulum backward, you know, and it is so much like, you know, let's go all the way with this. It's so much like the way that the Jews were regarded in Europe, you know, less than human. And so when we come to times like this and the debate comes up, and people are often saying, well, why don't you get over that? When are you people going to get past that? Why do you keep going back there? My classic line is, and see, that's why I've been blessed to hang out with my Jewish friends, because I'm just like y'all. Y'all say, never, not only are we not going to forget it, we say never again. And so we're moving now to say, no, the more we see it, society swinging back to that, no, never again. And therein lies the dilemma that we're in now, even as we face 30 some days of making a decision that has to do with the governance of this country. And so I think, you know, the fact that a Christian mindset, a biblical mindset, is being tossed around among evangelicals, whatever. You know, you've been giving us a lot of Hebrew. I'm giving you a little slave talk now. We say this: everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. See, so the fact that the cross is being waved, that's not impressive to us, because we want to see. We say, you know, it's not just faith; it's faith and works. And so the challenge that we have right now, even in this vote, is I'll go all the way to the deep end of the pool. Here's the problem that we face right now that's going to start debated in about an hour or so, the debate leading on to the decision. Here's the challenge. No matter where you fall on the biblical worldview spectrum, no matter where we fall on the biblical worldview spectrum, as it relates to politics, the biggest question is not where do you fall. The biggest question is, what is going to be your trade-off? Because either extreme, let's settle this. We would all agree with this. Whoever you vote for, neither one of them is the Messiah. Yours or not.
On that note, Bishop, I want to go ahead and actually take a quick break, because the conversation has been extremely enlightening thus far. And I want to have a minute to learn more about the Joshua Project so that we can come back and continue the conversation.
Earlier this year, America was seized by a wave of protests demanding that we rethink our approach to race. Now, whatever you may think of the protesters, their demands, and their tactics, it was hard to miss one essential notion. Everything about these massive marches that gripped just about every city and town in America felt, well, religious. The protesters toppled statues of men whose religious ideas they abhorred. They called on allies to wash the feet of the poor in public. They spoke of justice and sin and other words that you're much more likely to hear in church than, say, in Congress. And they were right to do so, because politics is and always has been downstream of religion. Our moral foundations determine what kind of government we want. And so, to understand America's moral foundations, to mute the constant noise that is our current political conversation, and to focus instead on answering the essential questions: what kind of government ought we to have? How should we live and why? We need to turn to the very beginning, to the document that inspired the men and women who built this great nation. We need to turn to the Hebrew Bible itself.
Okay, awesome. So, you know, now that we're reconvening, I want to take a minute and actually talk about the Christian influence in politics today. Since President Trump has actually taken office, evangelical Christians, were always influential, but they've certainly had a much more prominent role. People have recognized the influence of the evangelical Christians more, and we've seen that impact also here in Israel on the country here. That's from moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the hard hand that's been dealt against the Palestinians when they're terror. It's recognizing the Golan Heights. And most recently, the peace deals that we saw being signed on the White House lawn with Bahrain and with the United Arab Emirates. So let's start with you, Rabbi Lamm. Why is this important that this Christian influence has been behind many of these positive moves for the state of Israel?
Yeah, so this is a critical question. I want to try and use this to segue back to your point, Bishop, about the trade-offs, because I think that's really critical. So I want to start with a famous rabbinic legend that's, when you speak to your Jewish friends, and hopefully you have some you can speak to about this, tell them this story. It's a really important one. The tradition that the rabbis have is that at Mount Sinai, when God gave the 10 commandments to the Jewish people, he actually lifted up Mount Sinai and held it above the entire people and said, either you accept this law that I'm giving you, or I'll bury you right here. The Jews accept, the Israelites accept, and the rest is history. And the rabbis say, well, if that's the case, if the Israelites really accepted the covenant because they were forced to, they didn't have a choice, so how is it valid? I mean, and these are essential questions. I mean, Bishop, the reason I almost tear up when I hear you asking that question is because that, and when I hear you connect it to the Jewish story, that's the question that bothered rabbis for 1,500 years. How is it valid? Now, the way the rabbis answer that question is by looking, it happens to be by looking to the book of Esther. Because in the book of Esther, that's a sort of that's like a B-side in the Bible, right? Not as many people know the story of Esther. The story of Esther basically is that, where the Haman threatens to exterminate all of the Jews in Persia, and through Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, they managed to somehow save themselves and reverse the decree, and all the Jews of Persia are saved. One of the important things about the book of Esther is that, in fact, both in the Hebrew and in the various translations, like the King James, the name God never appears once in the entire book. Not because God wasn't driving those events, but because the lesson that it's supposed to teach, the ancient Jewish commentators believe, is that humans were the ones who actually took the lead in creating that salvation. And the rabbis say it was at that moment when the Israelites, not because they wanted to, not because they had a choice in the matter, but because that was where they were, and that was what history demanded of them. When they stood up and they said, we're going to take control of our own destiny with God, with the help of God, but we're going to play a bigger role in our own destiny, that's when the covenant finally became valid after 1,000 years. And you're so right. It resonates. The Jewish story and the story that you're telling really is on this parallel track in so many ways, where our communities have been given very little to no choice in the kinds of societies that we've been a part of. And the question then becomes, is there ever a moment that we have, and we have to be fortunate and blessed to find them, there are ever moments where we can stand up and say, enough is enough. We're not going to let people tell us how to be. We're not going to let people take agency for us. We're going to stand up, whether we had a choice in this or not, and create the kind of society that we want to see. And I think that's really where we're heading now. And I think, if you ask, and then that's why I want to hear about the trade-offs from you, Bishop. But I think, to get to Maayan's question, what's the role that Jewish and Christian communities have together? Well, I think really that gets to the same question of agency. I often joke, the Jewish community in America, we must be the only community in the history of mankind that spends 99% of our time talking to our enemies and 1% of our time talking to our friends. I mean, it's crazy. And we do it because we've often, we've had our butts kicked from east to west, from north to south. I mean, that's been our story. This is the best diaspora we've ever been in America. This is by far the best. And I think some of it comes from that sense of like, you know, we've always had to speak to our enemies, so we're just used to it. This is the first time in all of history that we've actually had friends, people who love us, not because they want our money, not because they want our help with something, not because they want us to be human shields for something, but because they actually believe in the promises that God gave to Abraham. And that's the American Christian community. And so this is the first time where, listen, we didn't ask to be in this diaspora. My grandparents fled here from the Nazis. My great-great-grandparents fled here from the Nazis. We didn't ask to be here. You know, Abraham Lincoln didn't have to be part of my story. Frederick Douglass didn't have to be part of my story. I feel like I could just as easily say, listen, when all of that was going on, my great-great-grandparents were in Ukraine and Poland. But I think the lesson of the covenant way of thinking is that, you know what? Our community wants to take agency over this story. So we're going to stand up and say, we want to see a different kind of society. And we're blessed, incredibly blessed in this era to have Christian friends like you all who are willing to stand up and say, listen, you know, we didn't choose to have the kind of relationship with Jews that we've had for 2,000 years, but here we are, and we're going to stand up and do the right thing because that's the kind of world we want to see. And so I guess the question becomes, Bishop, you know, at this moment, how is your community thinking about that kind of question, about agency and what we do at this moment, and what are the trade-offs, you know?
Well, a couple of things. Let me be real clear. I'm not speaking for all the Black people in the history of the world. So I say that tongue in cheek, but I say that significantly because contrary to what many people think, we are not a monolithic people any more than anybody else. We don't all think the same. We don't all fit into one box.
They
and
say
so
two Jews, three opinions. I'm sure they say the same thing for other communities too.
At least, you know, it's interesting that some of the folk that hate us hate you too. That's a whole nother conversation that, you know, way over on the right, some of the folk that don't like us don't like you either, you know. So we kind of have a common ground of being minority voices in a greater society. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that it took up until 2020, this year, for a Jewish person to be lion state in the Capitol? When RBG died. Isn't it interesting that we're still looking at first? You know, the first woman is the first Jewish person to lion state. It's just interesting how the dynamics work. I think that we going forward, the idea of what do we choose between, what are choices that we have, you know, my challenge is that there was a party that used to wave a flag of integrity, of character, of morality, and that was the foundation of what that party was, you know. Well, they're not waving that anymore because their guy has little and nothing of that, at least from the general perspectives. So you trade off that. So if you go on that side of the thing, that side of the fence, you're going to trade off those things because, you know, it's like a friend of mine said one time, when Obama was the president, he couldn't do anything right. And Trump's now president and he can't do anything wrong. You know, they overlook that because now you will sacrifice the integrity piece. You will sacrifice and so those things don't matter. And so we end up with one or two, and I'll tell you, the whole evangelical support of this man has to do with just one or two issues. And I got a problem with that because I got pro-life. I am pro-life. I believe in the right to life. I believe that. But there's a difference in being pro-life. Hold on, did I lose you? Am I still there?
You're still here, Bishop. It just seems that somebody has.
Yeah. So, but see, there's a difference in being pro-life and being pro-birth. And so what has been masqueraded for me as pro-life is pro-birth. Because once that life is past birth, does that life really matter? That life matters when it's in the womb. I got that. But that's pro-birth. What about the life after it comes here? What about the society that you're bringing that life into? So it's not just pro-life. Look carefully, and for me, it's leaning more toward just pro-birth. So that's a trade-off you got to deal with. On the other hand, when you go way to the left, you got to trade off that. You know, I quite honestly, and I hope I'll be wrong, my fear is I believe Donald Trump is about to eat Biden for lunch. He's going to eat him up without salt. He's not going to fight fair. He's not, and Biden doesn't know how to get nasty. And you can't fight a nasty fight if you're trying to stay clean. That's a whole nother conversation. I ain't got time for that right now. But I'm just saying that the choices that we have, when you go far left, the further left you get, the more principles and values that side takes are going to conflict with a biblical worldview, a Christian Bible, a Jewish Bible worldview. And so you're going to make a trade-off there. Either way you go, there's going to be a trade-off. And yet God says, in the end, I'm still going to be on the throne and God's still going to be in charge. So I'm struggling with that. I have Christian friends.
Bishop, let's make it real for just a minute. There are
Okay.
two candidates that are actually about to debate, as you just mentioned, Trump and Biden. Take 2 minutes and just go into this trade-off here and break down for us the pros and the cons of each candidate from your biblical perspective.
Well, again, the flags that are being waved on the right, from my perspective, place little or no value on character, on integrity, on just telling the truth, for heaven's sake. Just telling how we're trying to lead a country and we can't even trust what the man says. We have no trust in what he says. On the other hand, when you go to the left, like I said, you're going to get off into some issues that are going to be antithetical to what we, as we try to embrace the Hebrew Bible and Christian Bible. You're going to get further and further to the left, and so you're going to sacrifice some of those things. The problem is we only get one vote. Therein lies the problem. You only got one vote, and so again, whichever side you punch, you're going to give up some stuff, because neither one of them, and I don't think that necessarily God anyway, neither one of them is going to be right in line with our Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible worldview. You know, my classic line is, Black lives do matter. And Black lives matter because so much of the world has said and implied that Black lives don't matter. I support the Black Lives Matter message. I don't support the Black Lives Matter movement. They're so far left, I can't even see them. And so I make the distinction between the message and the movement.
Rabbi Lamm, do you do the same thing as the bishop? I mean, tell me about your perspective on this. Biden and Trump about to hit the stage. You can watch it, by the way, live on jpost.com if anybody's interested right after this. But Rabbi Lamm, tell me what your perspective is here.
Yeah, cut me off when you have to, because I'll preach on you.
So I don't have much to add on that analysis to the bishop. I think the bishop is exactly right in how he breaks it down. I want to add sort of, you know, if I could, you know, if you ask me what's the Hebrew biblical perspective in this election, I'd say nothing, because here's how the Hebrew
Right.
Because here's how the Hebrew Bible thinks about elections. You want to know what Hebrew Bible thinks about elections? Think about the Egypt story. Think about the Exodus. I mean, that's the fundamental text in the Jewish community. I know in many other communities. The villain of the Exodus story is Pharaoh. Now, my daughter, I remember the first time that she learned about it, she talked in Hebrew, the word is Paro. So, you know, Jewish kids call the Pharaoh Paro. So she always used to talk about Paro like it was his first name, right? Like Paro Johnson, right? Now, I had to explain to her that Pharaoh is a title. What's a title? I had to go through the whole thing.
Right.
The crazy thing is, archaeologists, historians have spent hundreds of years trying to figure out who Pharaoh was, because we have no idea. As far as the Bible was concerned, it didn't matter. That's the point. We don't know we don't know any of the Pharaoh's names. We barely know the names of any of the other rulers that the Bible mentions. I mean, because they're all titles, because fundamentally, the way the Hebrew Bible thinks is in long-term increments. So, in other words, you know, take Passover, for example. So, in my community, what we do on Passover is we read a text that's called, we have a ceremony, it's called a Seder. And in a Seder, on Passover, we reenact the Exodus story, and we think about, you know, all the times that the Israelites were redeemed and the Jews were saved from this calamity and that calamity. There's a joke that goes that if you want to understand any Jewish holiday, it's they tried to kill us, they couldn't do it, let's eat, right? That's kind of our thing. But the crazy thing is that when you tell this story, you're telling the same story that people have told for 1,000 years, for 2,000 years, for 3,000 years. Because what the Bible wants you to do is think about not this Pharaoh, this ruler, that ruler, who comes next. It's what kind of society do we want our children to live in? What kind of society do we want our grandchildren to live in? And the problem that we have now is that, especially the way that social media and the internet and cable news and the radio have affected our thinking, you know, some of these things are wonderful and it's allowing us to have this conversation now. So I want to acknowledge that. But part of the problem is it like encourages us to think in these like tiny, tiny increments, like a day at a time, like it's one tweet at a time. And part of what that does in this country is it encourages us to lock ourselves into this binary choice of two parties. The way I think about it is like the way that our system, it's like an old school, like 90s sitcom, right? Like Saved by the Bell or Fresh Prince or whatever, like those kids, the shows I watched as a kid, you always knew exactly what was going to happen. Like Screech was going to do something dumb and the principal was going to make a funny joke and then someone was going to save the day. There are no surprises. You knew exactly what you were getting in a Saved by the Bell episode. Now you could go on Netflix, you could go on Amazon, you could go on Hulu, you go on any of these places and you can find like the weirdest shows about like specific communities. Like one of my favorite shows is about like an Orthodox Muslim community. Like what does that have to do with me, like an Orthodox Jew? The answer is I just find a lot of insight and commonalities in that really specific story. And so part of what I think we need to do as we think about this election, the past election, the next election, is how can we get our society out of this fundamental trap where it's either this or that? Because the truth is, there is a silent majority in this country of people who have very different views, very different experiences, and we come from very different backgrounds, but we're united by faith, by a belief in a higher purpose, and by a belief that actually there is meaning in this society beyond what I get out of it and what you get out of it. And so the question is, how do we, and I don't, the truth is I don't have all the answers. If I did, I'd be a bad teacher. But I have the question. The question is, how do we break ourselves out of this mentality where we have to have these dumb choices between terrible on this side and ineffectual on that side, between horrible on this side and evil on that side? How do we actually build coalitions that are different? How do we build alliances that are different? How do we create connections between communities that you would think would never have anything to do with each other? How do we actually build those things so that when our kids and when our grandkids are on these kinds of conversations, they're not repeating the same kind of conversations and cliches and ideas that we are? That's the goal. So if the question is do we want this pharaoh or that pharaoh? Listen, there are trade-offs, and I think the bishop analyzed it perfectly. All I would add is that we want to think in terms of long time increments. We want to think about how do we act now? How do we create something new so that our kids and grandkids don't get trapped in this same thing that we're trapped in? That's the way I think about it.
Well, I think, again, Maayan, okay?
Yeah, go ahead. You know, we have only a few minutes left, and I think that it's really important that we get a final answer from each of you on the fundamental question, which is that we, regardless of our long-term vision, which is beautiful and exciting, the impact of the Bible, the trade-offs, there will be a decision that has to happen on November 2nd. What are Americans of faith called on to do at this very moment? Bishop, take 3 minutes, and then Rabbi Lamm, if you could take 3 minutes to end us off.
Yeah, my concern is with the protests and the activists, and my clarion call is, as you march, do march. As you protest. But when you march right on down to the voting booth and vote. Whatever your side is, vote. I agree with the pundits who say this is the most important election, but the problem that we do here, at the end of the day, we still only have two choices. I mean, if you're going to vote at all. And so I have ancestors who died and suffered and were put dogs on them and they were beaten for the right to vote. And so my call is all the activists, when you get through voting, when you get through marching, march down and get involved in this system. It is a system that needs to be addressed, whichever side, because at the end of the day, when you get through, God will still be on the throne and we'll move on to the next chapter.
I completely agree with every single word of that. And here's what I would add. Friends, do not let political commentators, pundits, newscasters, politicians, don't let them make you feel like you need to adapt to them. Don't let them talk down to you. We, and I mean this in the cosmics, in the biblical sense, we on this call have a tradition of revealed wisdom that is thousands of years old. This country, as worth fighting for as I think it is 200 something years old. What we have is ancient, is old. And I think what that means is that if we're going to be true to ourselves, we need to demand that our political culture and our politicians speak our language. We shouldn't let them force us to speak their language. And I'll give you just one really quick concrete example of that. There's a term that I hear a lot, which I think accurately describes something horrible and sick in this country, which is systemic racism. The term that I think we ought to use when we talk about that reality is actually not that. That's a clunky term that academics invented and are telling us to use. There is a biblical term for that, and it actually gets at everything that is, and that's idolatry. I mean, think about idolatry for a moment. Idolatry is a sin that not one person commits. It's something that affects a whole society. It's something where the structures of society are built in such a way that evil is being done, that something fundamental about humanity, about who we are, is being denied. And I think that if we want this country to get back on track, we need to start using our language. We need to start using our concepts, and we can't let people take those away from us. So when Bishop is correct, when you march in the streets, when you fight for what you believe in, whether you believe in this side or that side, use our language. We're fighting against idolatry. We're fighting against demons. We're fighting against the denial of everything that is good about what God created in this world. And we can't let our culture denude us of that, take that away from us. We need to use our language. And that's the important takeaway. If there's one takeaway, that's what I hope you all get from this evening. We need to use our language and our terms.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much, both Bishop Ulmer and also you, Rabbi Lamm. This was extremely enlightening, and I understand that there'll be more to this series. So hope that more people will be able to tune in and learn more about this.
Yes.
Now, are we able to take any questions, Gabi? How does it work?
I think, we only have a couple minutes left on our allotted time. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time because, the world keeps turning. But I know, Maayan, you had mentioned there was a question you had pulled out. I don't think you had a chance yet to bring it up. But we do have somebody from someone who filled out a form earlier today who wanted to have a question. So why don't we head that into the queue, Maayan? Why don't you bring that?
Great. So just as our last question then, one of the things that was brought up by one of the people who tuned in is the idea, and we brought this up actually a lot, so in many ways I think it's been touched on it, but maybe not completely answered, which is that race has really played a key role lately in the dialogue in American society, more so than ever with the Black Lives Matter movement and, the counterculture movement. So can you talk a little bit about how you keep faith in a nation when it seems that its policies are designed only to allow for certain ethnic groups to succeed? The fundamental question is, how are we meant to keep faith that things will get better for the nation as a whole?
Can I go first?
Sure.
Okay, I think there are two things. I think first of all, there needs to be a heart change. I think, I'm first to say God is the one who changes our hearts. The Bible says in Samuel that God can give us a new heart. So there's got to be a heart change. But in addition to that, there has to be, like you said, Maayan, policy changes. And here I'll use that term, Ari, systemic changes, laws that change. And that's going to take us right back to the polls, right? I mean, I can't make you love me. God can change your heart to love me, but I can pass a law that says you can't fire me because you don't love me. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and.
Interesting. Rabbi Lamm, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I would say, I agree with the bishop, and I would add, I don't think that it's important to get people to have faith in the nation. And I'll tell you why. Because the Bible says, don't put your faith in princes. There's no point in being faithful to a nation just because it's a nation. There are many nations, many of them are wicked. In fact, most of them are wicked. And if we're being asked to have faith in a nation just so that the nation can continue, that itself is idolatry. You talk about idolatry. Right. The only thing that makes this nation worth saving is if it has a purpose. And we have to clearly articulate what that purpose is. if we are to be in the language of Isaiah, Isaiah talks about, in the end of days, all the nations shall come forth and say, let us go to the mountain of the Lord. The word of the Lord shall go forth from Zion. I know the verse in Hebrew. The law shall go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. We need to articulate the idea of this nation as setting an example for all the other nations of the world. And the way we do that is by treating each other justly, by learning to live with people who are different, by learning to come together even if coming together is deeply hard and requires sacrifice, and more sacrifice from some than others. If we can articulate a divine purpose for this nation, then it's worth saving. If we can't, let's pack up and go somewhere else, because you don't put your faith in princes. That's how I think about this.
Great.
Wow.
The idea of quick comment. The idea of coming together. I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but if just Christians and Jews came together, we could change this world. And
I would add, Bishop, because I'm sorry, I mean to interrupt. The first temple, when Solomon builds his first temple, I think there's a misconception that Solomon is this great builder. I mean, he is. There's this conception that he's a great builder and he builds it by himself, and that's an incredible accomplishment. It's not what happens. You look in the book of Kings, what Solomon does is he actually reaches out to his neighbor to the north, Hiram of Tyre, one of the most powerful monarchs in the world. And he says, help me. Not because I need your help, but because if you build with me, we can build something that will be more magnificent, more glorious than anything you could possibly imagine. And it's at that moment that civilization begins. When two great peoples come together and build something better than they could have done on their own, that's when magic happens. And I on that note, I just wanted to say thank you, not only to you, Bishop, but to your entire community and to your family of champions for spending this time, for welcoming me into your home, and for welcoming, and to Maayan for welcoming us all and giving us a little bit of breath of the Holy Land, even over Zoom. This has been transformative for me. And I think if we can take this energy forward, we can build a nation that's worthy of a covenant, that's free of idolatry, that's free of systemic idolatry, and that is actually worthy of our faith in it. And Bishop, I can't thank you enough, and Maayan, I can't thank you enough as well. This has been really wonderful.
I love you, Ari. God bless you, man.
God bless.
Thank you all, Bishop and Rabbi Lamm and Maayan. All of you have been such champions, really borrowing that word for this group of this trio we've had this evening, this morning, this afternoon, really depending on where you are in the world. We're hitting I'm proud to be hitting all the time zones, but also really, I think, pulling a lot of heartstrings. And I think the questions that people have dropped into the chat are all super essential. And just seeing the group of people who were just tuned into this call, I think our number maybe went down by 1 or 2 over the whole evening. Really just people glued to the conversation. So thank you for being a part of it in this way. As you saw from the short promo of the Joshua Project, we are super excited about launching our full-on platform in the next month or so. And really stay tuned in your inbox for our follow-up questions about the survey, just to kind of learn a little bit more about you and about your interest in what we're working on. And finally, to get a chance to be an early user of our project that's launching, the prototype, which will be out very soon for you. So you follow up with us directly, and we'll look forward to being in touch. Stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, and you heard it from everybody here. Get out and vote. So that's on. You should be on your to-do list. So stay well, everybody. And
Maayan, get some sleep. It's 4
in
the morning.
A side order. We had to do a private message to Maayan for that. Stay well, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you again, Bishop, Rabbi Lamm, and Maayan, for keeping us really glued to the screen this evening and really having our brains move and our minds move and our hearts move. So thank you all, and we'll look forward to being in touch soon.
Next year in Jerusalem.
Okay. Amen.